So, but what's the message behind heroin? I grew up with the this is your brain on drugs, like that egg that's like, was it
Yep.
an egg in a frying pan or something?
Yep.
This is your
Yep.
brain, this is your brain on drugs. And those drugs were coke, crack, heroin. And so the messaging that I had in my head that I've had forever, and I think it's true for a lot of them, is if you do it once, you can be automatically addicted for the rest of your life. And so, of course, I stayed away because who would want to be a crackhead? Who would want to volunteer to have a heroin problem? Alcohol, we're told, as long as we're responsible with it, then we won't have a problem, which is false, false, false,
Mhm.
false. So I just want to point that out. I don't think it can be said enough that our advertising and our marketing and the propaganda for alcohol to keep it going, even though we know it's poison and that it is killing a whole lot of people, is that we just don't see it as being this addictive drug. So I wrote down a little analogy for how I see addiction and how you start off over here as that casual drinker, maybe a binge drinker in your teens and 20s, moving along into this person where all of a sudden you can't say no to it and you find yourself stopping at the store even though you promised you weren't going to drink and you just can't go without it now and you're realizing that. I feel like the equation, and I did write it down for you guys, is exposure, frequency, and time equals the addiction slope. And Alan Carr does a beautiful job of talking about like a pitcher plant in his book, The Easy Way to Quit Drinking, where he talks about a slippery slope. This plant is a meat eating plant or flower or something. And the fly will go in and it'll go after the nectar or the honey or whatever it is that they're going to eat. And as they're going down into the plant, they're not realizing there's no way out. They're getting sticky or the slope is too whatever. I can't remember what the ordeal was, but they didn't realize that as they're walking towards that prize that they were going to get, they were also going into the bottom of a plant that they couldn't get out of and they were going to get eaten. And he uses that analogy really beautifully for drinking. But another one that I like is Russian roulette. And when you think about exposure, frequency, and time, who is going to end up being a victim of a gunshot wound if we play Russian roulette? It's the person who spends more exposure with that gun. They play the game more frequently, and then over time, what's the odds that they're going to end up being injured by a gun, right? With Russian roulette. The same thing is true with alcohol. So if you've got that person who's like, oh yeah, I barely ever drink, or like, the addict is looking at the person saying, gosh, how can they just take it or leave it? Well, how much are they exposing themselves? Maybe this is the only beer they've had this year, right? Or maybe they only drink like a bottle of wine on a special occasion, or they only have champagne and that's it at a wedding. So they barely drink, so they don't have exposure. They're not doing the frequency and they're not doing it all the time. And over time, I feel like that's the only difference because if we continue to do it, we continue to go down that slope that we're not aware of. And then suddenly one day we find out that we're at the bottom of the plant, we can't get out, and we actually feel like we need the alcohol and we can't say no to it.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I love that description. And it's kind of like you talk about the pickle and the cucumber thing too. That's what I'm thinking of, right?
Same
Because
thing, damn it.
once we become to that, the